It's my job and a pleasure to introduce our speakers, or at least the first of our two speakers. The Bob Scardamalia is a recognized demographer, having spent his entire early career in New York State and working for the New York State school system, and retired from that and has become a well-known and well-thought-of consultant on these issues. And we're delighted to have him bring a third party's perspective to some of the demographic issues that we've been talking about to date. Bob?
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here and giving us this opportunity to talk about Arlington. It's actually kind of interesting because my graduate school work was done at Georgetown and lived nearby at just outside near Landmark Shopping Center. So this area is pretty familiar to me. My son lives out in Reston, so we're down here for grandkids pretty frequently. So it's actually data, kind of isn't always everybody's first topic. It is mine, and to be able to come back and look at this area and analyze this area has some interest apart from just the demographics. Yes, I am a demographer. Spent 30-some years in New York State as a demographer, chief demographer, and forecasts were one of my primary responsibilities and interests, and I continue to do that. What our role here, which one? Yep. Okay. What our role in this process, myself and Richard Gibbs, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes when I'm done, guess I better stand over here, is to review the methodology that is being used by the county and by the school district in developing forecasts. My side of this is in that county forecasting process, which I've done a lot of in New York State, helped state of New Hampshire do population forecasts for their counties. I'm working with the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, the New York region, in doing socioeconomic forecasts. So it's something that I have a great amount of interest and expertise in. And what I've found is, as a demographer, we tend to like demographic methods. Cohort component, migration, fertility, mortality, to forecast population. That's not the way it's done in Arlington. And it's not done that way in Arlington for, I think, some very good reasons. And the method that is used here, I think, is appropriate for this type of area. Arlington's a pretty dynamic place. Population movement in and out. High college population. Proximity to the district. Heavy commuting patterns, job development, commercial and residential mix. And so standard demographic methods, cohort component methods, I don't believe tell the whole story. I think they can be a component of the work, but they don't tell the whole story. So I've got some bullet points about the methodology that is being used. You've had materials describing the methodology, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of provide a framework, the method used here is basically a land use method, housing, residential, and commercial facility-based method. Quite appropriate in an area like this. New York City does something very similar. You have a stock of residential and commercial facilities, and being able to manage that stock, the changes in housing and commercial development, is a perfectly reasonable way to forecast, to monitor change and forecast change. And I think that works here. So it's very different than what I would look at as a standard demographic forecast. There's a piece that it doesn't provide, which is where I want to come back to link demographic methods with the housing and commercial real estate method. But it's a starting point, and one of the things that it's really critical to have in such a method is quality data. And so that's another place where I find that the county's methods are well-based. So it's a housing and commercial real estate. method. It's built off of the general land use plan. That method provides current estimates of population, of households, individual housing units, and employment. They all come off of that model, built off of the general land use plan, and monitoring change in approved development for current estimates. A couple of key things, key drivers or levers that can be used to monitor the method are occupancy rates for housing units. Yes, we can build a lot of housing units, but are they occupied? Number one question. You have to be able to monitor occupancy. Number two, average household size. So housing unit methods are, if they're built on quality housing data, are a good way of monitoring housing and households. The key unknown factor is how many people are in each of those housing units? What's the average household size? Because that's where the population comes from. And as you have changes in the type of housing, single family versus multifamily, large McMansion type homes versus apartments, condos, that changes that mix of housing type. So those are two key levers, occupancy and housing unit size. Employment estimates are based off of commercial real estate. And again, the county's land use plan and permit tracking systems allow for monitoring approved projects when they will come on, when they're expected to come online. We always have to keep in mind that when the expectation isn't always when things actually happen. We simply don't know what's happening in the future. But you have the data, and that's the important part. You have quality data that is built on a small geographic level, monitoring individual projects and development over time. So some of the important levers in that commercial side is, distribution between commercial office space, retail space, hotels, other things. And the county is monitoring that. One of the issues, though, is, as with housing occupancy, commercial occupancy. How's that changing? You don't have to look too far in this last recession to know that employment and office space took some hits in lots of different ways. And so monitoring those sorts of changes is not always an easy thing to do. And that vacancy is another lever in the method that can be used to monitor change over time and essentially not control, it's not the right word, to gauge the movement, the range of historical values around which occupancy in the commercial sector can move. In work in New York City, we found very similar kinds of things. There's a lot of historical data that you have to look at, and sometimes that historical data allows you to look at trends. But sometimes what you want to use that historical data for is just to provide some bounds on what is happening currently, and what I'm looking at today inside those historical bounds that provide some confidence. And that's what the county does. So commercial vacancy rates are important levers. CoStar is a private provider of that type of information. Okay, so again, it comes down to where your data sources, quality data sources. Very few folks have the ability and the resources to go business by business, building by building, and analyze occupancy. So a company like CoStar, that's what they do. But the county also, in their method, doesn't just use their data as it comes out of the box. It's got some levers in it also in terms of looking at the effect of BRAC and other types of development activities. One of the key things that I found really interesting was all of this occurs at the census block level. So it's very small geographic identifiers, which has an advantage because you can look at small geography and what's happening there. Its disadvantages, sometimes blocks are so small that the data quality can be questioned. The forecasting process, that's kind of the estimating process, but it also pretty much describes the forecasting process. Because as you're estimating residential and commercial activity currently, that same model, the land use plan, tells us what is planned to happen in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, what you can forecast in terms of approved plans. And so mathematically, the forecasting process works in concert with the estimating process. It's a question of moving from what do I know currently exists on the ground today versus what do I expect to be brought online and at what time in the future. But the model itself works very much the same and also at the block level. So you've probably gotten the idea right already that I think the model works pretty well. It's driven by quality data at a small geographic level. It's driven by a standard methodology of both residential and commercial development. There are some levers in there to move the estimates up and down. Fortunately, in the recent past, those levers have maintained a pretty narrow band of historical series. So they do continuous update and monitoring of the permit from tracking databases. That's, in lots of areas, they simply don't have the quality data. Issuing of permits is one thing. Actually knowing something that was built and occupied is something else. You need to have those other two pieces for the method to work well. The Arlington method captures those. It's a bottom-up approach, as I mentioned, from the block level analysis, and that's good because you've got the quality data. The flip side is, how do I control where that data will go out in the future? Can I develop a way that is maybe providing constraints if development provides a constraint? Or how do I gauge whether my forecast is outside of historical bounds? The integration of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, along with the database, the permit tracking database, and the models for reporting from those databases to access and manipulation, it's an integrated system, which you simply don't find in a lot of places. And I commend the county for their work in doing that. Recommendations. After our review of this methodology and speaking with the county folks who are intimately involved in it, a couple of things. Documentation. There are lots of pieces of documentation that exist, but it would be really nice to have a very comprehensive documentation of this whole model. So the GIS piece, the database piece, the estimates piece, the forecast, that's recorded, but you've got to go to a number of different places. So it'd be nice to have a consistent and comprehensive documentation. These two levers, the occupancy and average household size, as I mentioned, fortunately, recent past says that they're moving in a pretty narrow band. Okay? Average household size generally has declined. It's been relatively stable. You have, changes in the hundredths of position, 2.07 to 2.12, pretty narrow bound. But we also have some changes in living arrangements in this country. And in Arlington, I think it's important. And so 2 recommendations would be to utilize the American Community Survey data, not at a block group level data. The method is block oriented, but that small area data out of the ACS, American Community Survey, how can I say it delicately if there's anybody from the Census Bureau in the room? It's not the highest quality at a small area. At a county level, at a census tract level, there may be some additional information. That data can be valuable, and so there's a need to track that information and monitor it a little more closely. 2, again, adjust those levers of occupancy and housing size. The biggest thing that I think would be an advantage in the method that would add value to the method is age and migration analysis. When I started digging into the method, the county does a disaggregation of their current estimates of population by age. And they use the Census Bureau's data from 2010, the decennial census, but also their current estimates of population that provide age distribution data. That's good. But as you get further away from the census date, then the reliability of those estimates becomes more and more questionable. And when I started looking at that, it led me to the question of, well, what kind of migration trends are going on in Arlington? Because the method is not demographic. As a demographer, I like to see demographic estimates and projections. And so I started digging into looking at what was Arlington's pattern of migration from 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2010. And if you have a copy of the report that we submitted, the review report, you'll see on page 8 this graph that you can't see very well from mine here in front. When I did that, it just kind of blew my mind, because you've got this huge, relatively large in-migration of population in their 20s and even into the early 30s. My question is, what happens to them? Do they stay? If they stay, then you've got this group of population that is going to age in Arlington, and in 40 years, they're going to be how old? In their 60s, okay? Are they going to still be in Arlington? That's the key question. So the integration of a demographic method that would help understand this age distribution effect and the migration effect, I think, is an important additional component to the Arlington method. So that would be development of a cohort component method. The county's projections to 2040 for total population look perfectly reasonable to me. But what do they imply as far as the age distribution of Arlington's population when we go out 40 years? Will all of these in-migrants still be here? I think there's an important component here. Some of this is obviously migration. Arlington also has a large college population, college-enrolled population, but not a residential. They're not living in dormitories, group quarters in census terminology. And so my question is, what's happening with them? Are they part of this peak of in-migration? Should they be handled differently? So that's a long way of saying analysis of the age distribution and the migration effects in the county, I think, are pretty important as far as additional methods. And that kind of leads to number 8 here, the development of an integrated model. The economic side of this comes from commercial real estate and employment, but there's also larger macroeconomic factors that can come into play, and that's a model that's often used for regional analysis, and the Metropolitan Washington COG is using that type of model. So can there be greater integration at that level?